Big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
Hi, everybody. It's November the 28th, 2024, the year of our Lord. And we're so grateful that everybody could join us on this live broadcast of Leaders on the Frontier. We're grateful that so many of you could join us right across the country and beyond. And we really appreciate the many comments that we receive. It's so heartwarming, and the feedback and the encouragement. It means an awful lot to us. So today, as people come on board, we're very excited about the topic today. We're going to be celebrating a second edition book called From Truth Comes Reconciliation. So that will be the main part of our discussion. We've got a tremendous panel on board with us today. And before we get into that topic, I did want to highlight, as people come on, and good afternoon, Prairie. We're glad that you're back again. It's amazing the regulars that show up here for Leaders on the Frontier, and we're really grateful for that. You may have noticed the last week there's an awful lot of headlines happening. It's hard to know where to begin. But I'll begin with the so-called GST holiday that has been announced by the federal government, the Trudeau government. It's interesting, there's a new set of words developing in Canada. One is called vibe session. I think I'm using the word developed by Chrystia Freeland, our finance minister, who said, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland says her government's proposed GST measures will lead to a pickup in consumer spending, even as Canadians continue to feel malaise about Canada's economy. Quote, people have been talking about a vibe session and how that is a challenge for the Canadian economy. So what do you think? Vibe session, have you heard that word before? That's a new one to me, but will the $250 break, assuming it can be implemented, will that help your life? In the meantime, we've also heard a lot about the imminent incoming Trump administration in the United States on many accounts, one of which is the declared intention by the incoming president, back again for a second term, to impose a 25% increase on tariffs for both Mexico as well as Canada. So what do you think about that? It's been very interesting as different leaders in Canada scurry about to avoid that kind of increase of 25%. I think the Premier of Quebec, Legault, said the PM must get serious about the border. Getting serious about the border, that's probably news to a lot of Canadians, but we've got a number of concerns about not only people crossing the border illegally, but also the trading of fentanyl. And you may recall that from our last live last week, I read from, I believe it was a CSIS-generated document that was revealed just 2 weeks ago saying that Canada is now a significant exporter of illegal drugs, including fentanyl. So that's probably why we're on the radar with the incoming administration, is that's one of their promises they've made. It's interesting, Prairie said, I heard the bill right now is just that, a decrease for 2 months. This is the GST decrease. They've separated that $250 and one in April into a different bill that isn't even being looked at right now. So yeah, we'll see how that kind of break unfolds. And speaking of related U.S. news, I wanted to celebrate the nomination of certainly a friend and colleague of Frontier, that is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. He's been nominated to head up a very significant organization in the United States called the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health. So congratulations to Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, our friend. So today, our business at hand is to celebrate an incredible book, From Truth Comes Reconciliation. I've got a copy right here. It's the second edition, and it's really a compilation of work from an incredible team of people, and it was co-edited by two incredible people. And at Leaders on the Frontier, we, as you may know, we talk about many different issues, and some of them are not easy. And it's interesting. I think this is what you're alluding to. Stephen Mills says there was no truth involved, and reconciliation is an old Indian/Aboriginal word for more handouts. Wow, that's a cutting remark. But that's the point: is that this issue regarding residential schools is not an easy one to talk about because we've heard a lot of negative things about residential schools, the horrific abuses, but we talk about these issues not only with compassion but with truth. And I think that was the whole point, is that we need both truth and reconciliation more than ever as we talk about the story of residential schools. So I am very pleased to, in the spirit of the late Senator Murray Sinclair, who was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was launched so many years ago. There's a very famous quote that I wanted to share that came from Senator Sinclair. It said, "While the TRC heard many experiences of unspeakable abuse, we have been heartened by testimonies which affirm the dedication and compassion of committed educators who sought to nurture the children in their care. These experiences must also be heard." And that was by Senator Murray Sinclair. And I think in that spirit, we want to examine this book because it's a critical examination of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So on that note, I want to introduce the two co-editors and congratulate them. And they are, of course, Dr. Rodney Clifton, who's a senior fellow at Frontier. He's also a professor, and he is an incredible gentleman, as well as Mark Dewolf. And Mark and Rod, a warm welcome to both of you, and congratulations on this second edition book.
Thank you. We're very pleased.
Well, look, I want to start off by asking, we've got a lot of ground to cover about this book. So if you could help us understand why, Rodney, you decided to initiate this project with Mark Dewolf. Why did you do this from your perspective?
Well, it goes back a long time, not as far as Mark's history goes back, but in 1965, I was in an education program at the University of Alberta, and there was a program being developed called cross-cultural education to prepare people to work as teachers on reserves or in Alberta on Métis colonies, and I was interested in doing that. For one of the aspects of the program was to do an internship, and I was assigned to the Blackfoot Reserve in southern Alberta, 60 miles east of Calgary. And when I was there, I spent the summer there, 1966 summer there. I was boarded in Old Sun Residential School, in the teacher's wing of Old Sun Residential School. And there were children in the school at that time, and there were other people that worked at the school, including the priest, Reverend Brown, and other people, supervisors looking after the children. About 50% of the people working in the school were Blackfoot, and they spoke Blackfoot quite often. Most of the time when they were by themselves, when they were with other people, they spoke other English. So I spent the summer doing all kinds of internship jobs on the reserve, registering children for kindergarten, picking up children who were late or truant from school, helping put up the Sundance Lodge for the Sundance in the middle of August, branding cattle, haying with people. I did all kinds of things that was supposed to familiarize me with Aboriginal culture and what it would be like to be a teacher. At the end of the summer, unfortunately, Indian Affairs hadn't paid me the stipend that they promised, and I saw an ad in the Anglican Journal in the staff room of the school that they needed a senior boys supervisor at Stringer Hall in Nunavik. I applied for the job and I got that, and I spent the year looking after 85 kids in 3 dorms between the ages of 13 and 22 on duty for 22 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I learned a lot about Inuit children and Dene children and the non-Aboriginal children that were in residence. About 12% of the kids were non-Aboriginal, because in the north, all the kids went to residential school if they didn't have schools in their own community. Now, skipping ahead to 2015 very quickly, I read the summary volume when it was published, and so did my colleague Jaime Rubenstein, who's an anthropologist, and I wasn't very happy with what was said in the summary volume. So him and I got together and wrote up an article that would come out in the National Post saying that there's some limitations to it. About 1,300 of our colleagues signed a petition decrying that we were racist, even though Jaime's wife is a black person from the West Indies and my wife is a Blackfoot person from Aboriginal person from Alberta. We were called racist and insensitive to Aboriginals. The contrary-minded people published something in the National Post, and we responded to it. And jumping ahead, then to I talked to Peter Hawley and about writing a book on this. He thought it was a good idea. I had seen some of the material that Mark had written and published. We contacted each other and started talking about it, and we decided that we would move forward as being joint editors of From Truth Comes Reconciliation. 6 years later, we published the first edition, and then a couple of years from then, 3 years, we got a second edition coming out, which is a little bit stronger and a little bit better. It's got a conclusion in it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe I could just, you've given a significant summation there, Rod, is that if I understand this, then you have a long personal history of working with these residential schools. I mean, you dedicated significant years of your life caring for and loving these children. And then, to your surprise, you saw the summary coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation report, which is really a massive report. And you're kind of taken aback back to it. And you said, look, this is not really, dare I say, a balanced perspective of the residential school story. Is that basically the bottom line?
Yeah. And my wife had been in Old Sun Residential School for 10 years. So I had talking to her, of course, about her school experience, which she used to call, when we were young, people would say, oh, did you go to residential school? Because they hadn't met Aboriginal person before. And she said, no. Typically she would say, no, I went to a private Anglican school.
Okay.
Not a residential
So Rod,
school.
that's part of your story. Mark, why did you get involved in this project?
Well, as the son of an Anglican minister who became the principal of two Indian residential schools, one in southern Alberta on the Blood Reserve, Kainai Nation, and the other in the town of Latuc in Quebec, serving Northern Cree. And as the son of this fine man, I grew up pretty well. I spent most of my childhood at St. Paul's Anglican Residential School in Alberta. And I went to school with the kids and right through to grade 6. And then after grade 6, I went into town with them on the bus for secondary school. And then I was off to college. And those years were very formative for me. I cannot say that I mingled really well with the Blackfoot kids. I could have done more, I suppose, but I was a short and unathletic little kid, very booky, nerdy kind of kid. So I didn't really fit in with the Kainai boys. But they did not mistreat me, and my years there were generally quite happy. And so my impression of a residential school, of course, was fairly positive. And then later, when I was in college, I would travel to Quebec and visit the school in Latuc. And there I saw very similar. I saw cheerful kids getting off the bus from the float plane that brought them in from their remote communities. The staff seemed just as dedicated and kindly as the staff at St. Paul's. And so that was my experience, and I had pretty positive ideas about the residential school system, until, of course, out came some of the stories. They started small and they started to multiply. And when that happened, I began to question. I thought, well, had I been blind? All right. And had my parents dedicated a part of their lives to something that was a genocidal, horrific experience for many kids? So I had to find out. So I started looking. I began by checking books, any books I can get a hold of, and you can see that I've managed to get a hold of quite a few. Rod may have a lot of these books too. And I collected newspaper clippings. I started clipping articles from newspapers, creating my own little library of stories about the residential schools and about Indian issues generally. And then the more I looked into it, the more complicated the whole thing began to be. I could see that, yes, some very unpleasant, harmful things took place in residential schools, and no question about it. And when the TRC was established, I made connections with the TRC, and I was invited to give a presentation at the Halifax National Gathering. It was well received. People were very respectful and kind to me. The Bishop of Nova Scotia thanked me for sticking up for residential school staff members. And then when there was a second another national gathering, there were several in between. But when they had a national gathering out in Edmonton, I flew out hoping to get in touch with former students, fellow students. And I gave a small presentation there in a sharing circle. I met Murray Sinclair in a hallway on my way to one of the meetings, and he shook my hand. He heard my story. He thanked me for coming all the way from Nova Scotia and for sharing my story. And so that heartened me. The way I was respected and generally received, the hug I got from a former St. Paul's student who recognized who I was as soon as I said my name to her. She was looking at a display of this various schools. I told her who I was, and she gave me a big smile and a hug. And that kind of encouragement got me even more into the issue of residential schools and caring about how the story is being told. When the TRC report came out, of course, I read the whole thing, and I was surprised at how simplified and even slanted and distorted the summary and legacy volumes were. It was as if all this work had been done to collect all sorts of testimonies, some of it positive. I'm in there somewhere, I think. And yet the summary was negative, negative, negative. And of course, the media was all negative, 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 because the journalists didn't read the entire report. So the TRC did not, in my view, add to our Canadians' understanding of the complex and nuanced and very human history of these residential schools over a period of 113 years. There were dozens and dozens of the schools run by different Christian denominations. There were different parts of the country. It's a complicated story, and I think Canadians are up to the challenge of looking at a complicated story and taking it in. But no, all they get is the simplified story. So when Rod approached me and we had a chance to bring the more complex picture of the residential schools to the Canadian public, I agreed. I probably jumped at it. And it's been a worthwhile endeavor, although it has taken some time. But fortunately, I'm a retired person and I was able to spare some. So that's basically my story. I should add, I suppose, that I am a little bit enraged at the injustice of the whole thing, in the sense that people like my parents, their friends, and the Indigenous people from the reserve who used to come and have tea parties with my parents, and the kids, former students with some of whom I still keep in touch via Facebook, they're being denigrated. And that seems to me unjust. And I don't think there's anybody here, anybody watching or listening today who stands by idly and when injustice is going on. It seemed unjust. And so that too drives me to speak out, stick my head above the parapet, as it were.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark and Rod. So I'm speaking, if you've just joined us, with the co-editors of the book called From Truth Comes Reconciliation, the second edition. We're marking the occasion of the release of that book. And I think you've both spoken eloquently about your own personal experience, as well as the concern about not only the horrific things that happen at residential schools, but also standing up for the good things that happen at residential schools in terms of education, and also the people that really dedicated their years of service to people right across the country. So I think part of this is what you've both alluded to is a narrative, a kind of a message that's gone out about residential schools that is all quite disturbing. It's all universally negative. So when you hear about the claims that people should be labeled as denialists, what do you think? Are you a denialist about residential schools? What does that mean to you, Rod?
That's what they claim, but both Mark and I have had actual physical experience in these schools, living in these schools, and working and knowing people that went to the schools at a time before this became an issue. The first paper that I published on residential school was on the integration of children into Stringer Hall, looking at Dene, the Indian children, the Eskimo children, the Inuit children, and the white children integrating, and I published that in 1973. So I've been involved in this kind of work for a lot longer than some of the people that are our adversaries have been alive. Not that I should hold that against them, but if they would have had some more experience, they would have had a less negative opinion of what actually went on. If they actually lived in one of these schools, they would have known some of the positive things that went on. And there were lots of kids in the school that I worked in that were had difficult home lives, so that the schools provided a safe haven for these children when it wasn't so good to be at their homes. And that part of it is not being heard. That aspect of residential school. There were orphan children in the Old Sun, 3 girls from Hobima, and in the summertime they were the only kids in the school. The people in the school looked after these children when nobody else would look after them, and that part is not. So Mark says, we have to be careful in condemning all of these people for doing bad things when we know that they've done a lot of good things as well.
Okay, so Mark, one of the things that I'm intrigued about is, and this is, I found kind of confusing, because you alluded to the original Truth and Reconciliation report as being a very long document. I have had the privilege of reading the entire document, and it's interesting, in my conversation with so many journalists, I can say confidently almost no journalists have read it, maybe a handful, because the entire document is 3,400 pages approximately. And when we refer to the report, people are often confused. They think it's the 300-page report. It's not. It's the 3,200-page report. Is that right?
Well, the whole report is of thousands and thousands of pages. Correct.
It's thousands of pages long, but
Yes.
often it seems like almost no one has read that report. Is
That's
that
right.
part of the frustration? Because the summary that I come across, the one that I think Rod is holding there, doesn't seem to be really, frankly, based on that original report. Is that part of the problem, what's going on here?
Very few people have waded through all the other volumes. And those are volumes that contain positive testimonies. And the TRC made it very clear that it wanted testimonies from everybody. I have here a letter written to the Anglican Church of Canada from the TRC, says, sadly, the number of former staff is rapidly declining. To ensure their voices are heard, we must work quickly to reach out to those who are still with us. We must let them know that the TRC is interested in what they have to say and that their memories will be respected. For this, I would like your assistance, both to identify former staff who maybe wish to speak with us and to reassure former staff that we are interested to hear from them. So it's an encouraging thing. And if you read the full report, then you see that the workers, the people who did the research, including the researcher who interviewed me and my sisters, went after as many testimonies as they could get, and they wanted to know. I think some of them may have entered into the research with a bit of bias. The very respectful and very sensible woman who interviewed me was quite surprised to hear that St. Paul's didn't have a fence around it. She obviously had preconceived ideas, and that may have been true of other researchers too. The TRC had, I think, originally noble motives, and I think the work that was done by the people who worked at the commission and the three commissioners deserve respect. But I do wish I knew who wrote the summary and legacy volumes, because to me, they sound like somebody who went into it with a very blinkered, one-sided view.
Yeah. Indeed. So I'm talking with you, Rod, and Mark as co-editors of the second edition book, From Truth Comes Reconciliation. It's a critical review then of the larger report. And I think it was I found it to be a very meaningful book. There's a picture of it up on the screen, because you actually have a very gifted team of analysts that went in. We have, frankly, understanding the TRC report is the first set of chapters, and you have a critical analysis of the report. And I guess for me, one of the things that was also very moving about it is you got into personal stories and reflections of people who attended the schools, and even yourselves. And there's some pictures of children at a residential schools. And it was very interesting to hear their testimonies. And if you read the original report, you see a lot of positive testimonies. So why did you include those personal stories? And I think there's a picture of I believe it's Elsie McLaren. Rod, why did you include her story?
This was from Lee Meadows, and she told about her family. Her family was both students in the schools as well as teachers and administrators in the schools. So she has a very interesting history. And so she told a story about how her family was involved in this. And very few people have heard, somebody that was Aboriginal, part Aboriginal, and was a student in the school, and her husband and herself worked in the school at later periods of time. So we wanted to give a human face to the experiences that people have. So there's a whole section, part 3, as personal reflections on schools that people were in, including a couple of stories that chapters that Mark has written, and a chapter that I wrote on my own experience, and Lee Meadows' experience, and Marshall Draper's experience, and some other people's experience as well. So we wanted to both summarize what the history up to the TRC Commission, and then summarize the TRC Commission report, and then criticize it, and then give some reflections on people's experiences in the schools.
Okay. Well, look, I'm also very delighted today at this book launch to also welcome 2 very special guests. The first one is Marco Navarro-Genie. He's the Vice President of Policy and Research at Frontier. A warm welcome to you, Marco, as well as Barbara Kay, a well-known columnist who's also written extensively about residential schools as well, and this background. So a warm welcome to you, Barbara and Marco.
Thanks, David.
So, Mark, I want to begin with you and ask you, I mean, you're a researcher and analyst. Why is this book significant? Why does this really matter in your point of view to Canadians? Oh, I think we've got an audio issue here. We can't
Unmute.
quite hear Marco. Oh, there we
Unmute.
can.
Nope.
Yep. Just for a
Oh,
sec.
we still can't hear Marco. We must have a technical problem here. Barbara, can we hear you? Do you want to answer that question? Why does this book matter to Canadians?
I think, I think history, our own history, the history of this country matters or should matter to Canadians. And I think actual history should matter, not narratives about what one group has decided what its history is, if it doesn't correspond to actual evidence. The TRC was labeled as, or was promoted as a form of getting to reconciliation, but you can't have reconciliation unless all voices are heard, all voices are respected, and that was simply not the case. One of the writers in this book, was it Jerry Bowler, perhaps? I'm sure Rod or Mark could tell me, who said that the commission was more a kind of therapy, a sort of treated it as therapy for wounded souls, and a kind of coming together of people who wanted to purge the grief, and they were encouraged to treat these sessions that they would come to as not so much witnessing of actual history, but more of a way of pouring out their own trauma and feelings of hopelessness and feelings of having been victimized, and the idea of perpetual victimization, a kind of sins that can never be expunged, that were imposed on these helpless people who had no agency then and who continue to have no agency because all those sins of the past are still present in our society. And this view of our First Nations, it reinforces this sense that nothing can be done about, and that all Canadians, whether they are the children of, or the grandchildren or great grandchildren of the imperialists, the English and the French who came here and settled in Canada, or whether they came last week from somewhere where they never heard any of this history before, are all equally guilty. So more of, I don't know, I think this commission was, I don't want to say, I think it began in good faith, but my impression is that it was never intended to be put into the archives as real history. Something that was shocking to me is that you can have a 3,000 plus page report with no index. That is, and I know that there were millions and millions of dollars that were provided for the researchers and for the, so the money was there to have a proper document that historians could consult, and journalists. And by the way, to expect journalists to read a 3,000 plus document in preparation for an 800-word column, someone like myself, for example, with no index, is very insulting. And I would, of course, never bother to read. Of course, I would only read the summary, and I don't apologize for that. I think the fault there lies with the people who produced the document to begin with. So I think there's a lot of motivation. Francis Widdowson goes into the whole question of how much money was involved and reconciliation. It seems to be that in the minds of activists and those who promote it the hardest, and that it really is all about the money and the payouts, which were substantial, more than $1 billion in payouts for what is regarded as survival. That word itself, a little disingenuous, just as word genocide is. But having gone to the school itself is regarded to have gone through horrendous ordeal that needs monetary compensation. So.
Okay. So Barbara Kay, I think you've powerfully underlined the whole notion that history matters, truth matters, facts matter, and that a variety of voices are around the whole history of residential schools. It shouldn't be just one. So I think I'm just going to come back to Marco on that question as well. Why does this book matter, Marco, from your perspective?
Hello. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
We can hear you now, loud and clear.
That's awesome. Technology works. Thank you, David, and thank you for your patience. This is, as I was trying to say earlier, when you could hear me, this is an important book because truth matters. And the whole point, one of the greatest, perhaps, successes of Western culture and Western civilization is this emphasis on telling the truth. Because without telling the truth, there is all bunch of separate realities everywhere, and nothing to connect us as individuals, as people, as a society. And we have, unfortunately, sort of careened out of that path in Western societies in the last sort of maybe 20 years or so. And so what's important about this book is that it offers a different kind of version of what took place in what happens to be an important chapter in the history of this country. History and truth matter because history and truth also are components of our individual makeup, but also of our collective identity and our national identity. People say that we live in a post we live in a post-industrial world. We live in a post-national world, and some people claim that we live in a post-truth world. What I emphasize about this book is that it brings us back to a culture where truth matter, and it makes the emphasis that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all the efforts to recover the past must also include the truth about the good things that happened.
So well said, Marco Navarro-Genie. Thank you for that insight. Truth does matter. And the search for truth collectively is quite a process. And what I liked about the book is that you were bringing together quite an outstanding team of analysts to try to look at the report, the massive TRC report, from a number of angles to understand, hey, so what really happened here? And looking at through a number of lenses. And that's such an honorable, worthy project. I've got a number of quotes in the audience here. If I go back to Francis Widdowson, and it's great delight that you're here, Francis, because you're one of the authors that contributed to the book. You also said there was a dynamic where people testifying influenced one another's memories because they were highly suggestible. And then you also say relative truths and rent seeking. I think rent seeking is a very interesting term that you use in one of the chapters on that very topic, is that sometimes parties can stake out ground and actually get payments out of it. I think that's kind of part of that policy. And I think there's also a Philip Blaine, I believe, said a very nice comment. Indeed, very eloquent introductions to both co-editors. The ongoing conversation is also most cogent. So thank you very much, Philip, and thank you, Francis, and thank you for all your comments. I think what strikes me then about also the reviews that have been coming in, there's a lot of very good reviews. I just want to highlight that we have the late William Gardner said, finally, thanks to the balancing facts revealed in this book, Canadians will, for the first time, be able to balance their own consciences with respect to the truth, the good and the bad, that comes from our long experiment with residential schools, much of which were regrettably omitted in the summary of the TRC report. So just to clarify something about residential schools, did all Aboriginal children attend residential schools, and was it by force? Who wants to answer that? Can you answer that, Mark?
Yes, I can. Rod and I have both looked very hard at records to determine this, and it would appear from the records, certainly I went to Indian Affairs annual reports to see what the enrollment number were and to see what the population of the Indigenous population of Canada was at the same time, the number of Indigenous children of school age. And it worked out to about a third of school age children during the 113 years of the residential school period actually attended a residential school for a period of, and we worked this out from the common experience payments, for about 4.5 years was the average. So while some students certainly stayed at residential schools for more than, well, 7 or 8 years, if they like my fellow classmates, went through grade 6 and then went to secondary school in town, but still living at the school. So they obviously went for 7, 8, 9 years, but others only went for 1 or 2 years. And one of the flaws we think in the whole report of the TRC is that it doesn't get into this. It doesn't make that very important data available to people. 1/3 of students.
So just to clarify, so Mark, you're saying that the original TRC report didn't get into basic facts and analysis about the number and scope of students that attended the schools?
No, you can go looking, but you won't find that 1/3 figure or anything close to it. You won't find the 4.5 years as an average period of enrollment. That seemed to have been skipped over.
And what were they voluntary? Was everyone forced to attend the schools? Yes or no?
No is the simple answer. Later on, when residential schools became a kind of welfare agency, when welfare agencies became a very Canadian thing to have, the schools certainly became more welfare focused than they had been previously, though they had always had a welfare role for children from families who could not look after them. And the schools obviously were a great place for the child to have food, medical attention, care, and so on when things were not so good at home. But in terms of enforcement, the amendment to the Indian Act in 1920 that mandated all Indigenous children of a school age should go to school did not say residential school. It just said schools. And they had a choice. And one of the things my father wrote in a school newsletter was an appeal to parents that they send their child to the residential school rather than other schools where they would not receive the care and the security that St. Paul's offered. No, any claim that 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend a residential school is just plain wrong. Big numbers, of course, are very important. They get attention. It's the kind of looseness in language that we see everywhere. Somebody was really a journalist who was really on the ball would have specified what was meant by that. No, they were mandated to go to school. Did they? Well, actually, even after the mandate, a lot of them did not go to school at all during the 113 years of the residential school period. Another third, we think, from the records, another third just didn't attend any school at all, despite the fact that it was mandated by the government. So obviously, it wasn't obviously enforced very closely.
But I think those are very helpful basic facts that kind of frame up this residential school analysis, and it's certainly well talked about in the book. And I think that's very revealing, and frankly, in great contrast to much of what we hear today in popular media is just the opposite. That people were forced to attend, and that virtually it's implied everybody did attend, which is simply not based in factual reality. So, Barbara, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is when you talk about how truth matters and history matters, is that you've used the term in the past that this is a kind of a field of contested history. What do you mean by that? I mean, it strikes me that this is one of the things that we struggle with as Canadians. How do we talk about these sensitive issues if this is so deeply contested?
Well, it's contested in the sense that we, the people that you're speaking to right now, the historians who are represented in this book, come from a tradition of the European Enlightenment, where the scientific method or evidence-based research, produces truths that there's evidence for these truths. So that is our tradition, and that would be the tradition that we would want to pass on to newcomers, and as well to that are not from places where this form of getting at the truth is recognized or respected, and what we would certainly our ancestors would have passed on to the children in their care in schools. What they are saying is, no, we come from another cultural tradition. Our cultural traditions do not respect your way of getting at the truth. We have our own truths. These truths are generated from our feelings, our spirituality, whatever they are. But they are equally valuable, are equally worthy of respect. So there's this parallelism that we are forced to, that we are considered bigoted if we deny. If we say no, if we want real history, it has to be evidence-based. They're saying, well, that's your tradition, and it's the tradition of an oppressor. We know our own history, and we have the right to define our form of oppression. We have the right to be, whatever we say about our history must be respected because we're the ones saying it. Well, I don't think anybody who's been raised in our traditions of, educational methodology can respect a so-called history or a narrative that is not evidence-based. I don't. But that does not make me a denialist. It does not make me a racist. It doesn't make me anything except somebody raised in a tradition that we feel is the best way to find out what happened, in the past. And we can't deny people the right to say, well, my cultural history is what I say it is. Well, you can say that. But that doesn't mean that the government should be handing out money on the basis of what you say, even though there may be evidence for some, and some of what you say may not have evidence but may be true. We don't know. I mean, the idea is you don't say that somebody has more value simply because they were oppressed or because they were, in terms of presenting the evidence that other people are supposed to sign on to.
No, it's fascinating, Barbara, your comments that it almost seems like different worldviews or
Yes, it is.
epistemologies are developing here in terms of what is truth here. What do you think, Marco? What's your sense of what's going on here?
I think what Barb is saying illustrates the larger problem that we have in our culture, in postmodern culture, that is, that all perspectives are the same. But it's worse than that, because as Barb points out, we now favor the culture of the oppressed. And so what we are really saying is not that all perspectives are equal. What we are saying is that all perspectives are equal, but some are more equal than others. And the ones that are more equal than others are the perspectives of those who claim to have suffered. And the actual result of that is not inclusive, even though that's what we are pretending to be. Because the moment that you insult or try to silence those whose ideas you don't embrace or you disagree with, you end up essentially with this cancel culture, or this idea that people who don't think the way you do need to be censored. And so it's a role reversal in the sense that the victims now become the oppressors of those they claim are the former oppressors.
Okay, so this strikes me that this is often referred to as cultural socialism in the sense that there's a kind of a worldview where the priority is on the story of those groups that are perceived to be as victims, but we don't put the primary onus is really not on the truth, but it's something else. It's a different narrative. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, it's a completely different set of values other than truth. Truth becomes essentially transactional. Truth becomes a tool to oppress others or to attack those who oppressed you.
Yeah,
Okay, wow.
the
So
other,
Rod, as you reflect on this conversation, and I know that you have such a heart for Aboriginal people, all Canadians. How do we reconcile in this type of challenging environment where it seems like I know that reconcile means by definition to make peace with each other in relationship. How do we restore a relationship if we have, frankly, very different versions of the truth?
So I think one of the things that we're trying to do with the book is we're trying to point out some actual facts about the case. And so, uh, as Mark knows from his experience at St. Paul's, and I know from my experience at Old Sun, that many of the children in the southern reserves went home during the weekends. So if the kids were forced to go to school, if they went home on the weekends, why didn't they just stay home? Which some kids did, but not very many kids did. And in the north where I worked, uh, when they were picking up the children, either by boat along the Mackenzie River, or by float plane, it was broadcast on CBC radio, Delta Roundup, where the plane would land, picking up children to come to Inuvik to go to school. And if parents wanted their children to go to school, they would be at the lake where the plane was landing, and their children would get in the plane with their parents' blessings and be sent to school. So that fact, I think, we should make a difference, but it doesn't seem to be. Another fact that we pointed out in the book is about 40% of the schools had Aboriginal names. So you had Old Sun, Crowfoot, Assiniboine, Athabasca, a whole bunch of schools that had Aboriginal names, as we've got many Aboriginal names. Canada is an Aboriginal name. Winnipeg is an Aboriginal name. Manitoba is. Saskatchewan is. Saskatoon. We can go through the country and find thousands of these Aboriginal. If these people are so prejudiced against Aboriginal people, why why did they name the schools after Aboriginal people and not after saints? So if you judge the 40% that have Aboriginal names, it's not 100%, but it's not
Hmm.
zero. And you compare that to, let's say, the saints, there's more Aboriginal names than there are saint names. And we think
Hmm.
that fact is an important fact for people in Canada to think about in terms of how prejudiced and how genocidal these schools actually were. I, I don't know if you go to the death camps in Germany, will you find any named after the people that are being brought to those camps? Probably not.
Hmm.
But in
Yeah.
Canada,
No,
we've got.
it's fascinating, Rod, your references to the fact that I know in your own experience, you learned uh, quite a bit of fluency within Aboriginal language. But so was it forbidden for children to speak their own language in many schools? What is your experience, and also what does the research say about that complex question? Because there's so many sites involved.
The TRC report actually doesn't talk about this very much, except making the claim that there was cultural genocide. But as Mark's experience has been, being in school with the children, and being in the dorms with them and in the playrooms with them and out in the playgrounds with them, as soon as the kids got out of class, they spoke their native language. In Inuvik, we had two junior supervisors that looked after the junior boys and the junior girls, along with another supervisor who were Inuit women, young Inuit women, and they spoke to the kids all the time in Inuktitut. So 70% of the kids in Stringer Hall were Inuit, and many of the children, when they come in first, they didn't have a word of English. They just spoke Inuktitut. So we had a young woman that looked after the junior boys and another young woman that looked after the junior girls, spoke to these kids all the time. I remember, kids coming down the hall, little kids, not the big kids. They would always switch to English, but the little kids coming down the hall, Inuit kids, and they're speaking, especially the girls, they're speaking Inuktitut, and they're coming down the hall, and I would go like this, and they put their hands over their mouth, turn around, hold on to each other's arms, go walking the other way, speaking Inuktitut again, and then look back at me with great big flashing brown eyes. It was kind of a game. Of course, we wanted them to learn how to speak English, but nobody punished kids for speaking their native language. And I heard lots of kids speaking their native language in the dorms at night. The Inuit kids. The young kids would tell ghost stories, and they'd be speaking Inuktitut and pushing their beds together and telling stories to each other. So
interesting. Mark, what was your experience, Mark?
Yes, the students at St. Paul's spoke Blackfoot when they weren't in class, and I learned very little of the Blackfoot language. Unfortunately, I learned to say "oki," hello, and "nuwa," which meant look out. Very often heard on the playground when a supervisor was coming around. So I have a Blackfoot name. When my family arrived, we were all given Blackfoot names, and my name, if I can pronounce it properly, is Inokatkoy Skini, which means little yellow hair. And my father was a tall man coming up the hill, and so on. We were welcomed, and likewise, I wanted to raise a point here, if I'm allowed to show a couple of photographs. People don't realize that a good number of the staff members at residential schools were themselves Indigenous. And if they saw horrible things going on, surely they would have done something about it. Here's a wonderful picture, one of my very favorites, which shows some of the Indigenous staff members at St. Paul's, along with women from the neighboring community, women's auxiliary perhaps. And it includes also a picture of my mom up in the upper left-hand corner and my older sister. It's a wonderful, wonderful photo because to me it captures the mingling that went on at St. Paul's. Not so much mingling at the Latuque School, of course, because the Latuque School was so far away from the northern Cree communities that it served. But the kids at Latuque seemed pretty happy, and my father was very smart. Early on, he got us a Bell and Howell a movie camera, and we have movies of St. Paul's and Latuque. And the movies show people active, happy, cheerful, enjoying themselves. Why? Well, life back on Mistassini Post wasn't all that great for young children and teenagers growing up. And so one thing I wanted to make, the point I wanted to make earlier, one of the things that spurred me on was when I first started investigating, raising questions and so on, I was told by a writer who had been condemning the schools that I mentioned the word balance when I was talking to him. He said, no, there's no balance. Don't say balance. There's no balance. Well, that was to me a clear sign that I understood no 50-50. I could see him saying, there wasn't any 50-50 good and bad. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. I don't know. But to say that there was no balance at all, and that told me this is propaganda. This is not actual academic investigation or thoughtfulness. This is just, I don't want to hear that.
Interesting. So I guess part of the thing that's confusing in the public debate is the word genocide. Um, Genocide is certainly within international law is a well-known definition relative to actions that would frankly kill off an entire population. But cultural genocide, what does that really mean today? And is that a kind of a intellectual sleight of hand in the sense that I don't understand the difference between integrating within a larger society? I know that the historical context for the establishment of residential schools was a very difficult environment in the sense that there was industrialization happening over the last few hundred years. And the question was, how do we integrate everyone for success within Canadian society? And I understood from that historical context, and I think Joseph Cornell within the book talks about this well, is the sense that there was a need to, as there is today, to educate everyone. Canadians today cannot move forward in society without some semblance of education. But having said that, if we talk about cultural genocide, does it mean that residential schools was just simply a bad idea and it should never have happened? Any thoughts on that, Barbara?
Yes, I have many thoughts on that. First of all, the absolutely sine qua non, the absolute non-negotiable thing about genocide that you must have in the definition is the intent to kill off either a whole or a great swath of a population. And so the use of that term to me is highly offensive as a member of a people who experienced what is considered to be the worst genocide, actual genocide in recorded history. To talk about this as a genocide is really terrible. What it was forced assimilation. You can say forced assimilation is a bad thing if you want, but that's what it was. If they had really wanted, if they had the intent to kill, literally kill, or even culturally kill the natives population, they would have done nothing at all. They wouldn't have educated them, and they would have let them go about their their sustenance living, hunting, fishing, and never learning English and everything. They would have died off naturally because they could not have existed in the world created. The world around them. They could have not have entered cities. They could not have gotten jobs, and they would have died out as peoples, as many people have, and as many languages have died out. They speak their languages today because they were forced to go to school, and they learned English, but they also kept their languages going, and they were allowed to do that because of all the money that has gone into maintaining them on reserves and in other emoluments that they get. So I do find it very manipulative, very, very appropriative, if you want, and very offensive that the word genocide, that they are so intent on it, forcing that word into the conversation. It is an appropriation of true genocides, and everybody from any people that has experienced, whose people have experienced genocide, have the right to be offended by this co-optation of that word.
Okay, so the word genocide is a significant word, and it begs the question, how is it being used? I notice a quote in the chat here from Jeanette Murin, who says, just because children who went home on weekends and returned to school on weekdays isn't proof that abuse didn't take place. Abuse creates a deficit in self-worth. How about that comment? Is abuse in that kind of form as well? So we can't make assumptions. I think, Jeanette, that's what you're getting at regarding that comment as well.
Yeah.
I think the assumptions go the other way in a kind of terrible way, because the whole thing assumes that trying to assimilate people into a culture necessarily negates the other one. Look, I have some experience with this because I arrived in Canada as a teenager and was forced by the weight of law to go to French-speaking school, because originally when I came, I went to school in Quebec, and supervisors were after us so that we spoke French in the school corridors, and we had buttons that said that everything needed to be happening in French and what have you. But the assumption is that because I was compelled to learn French, then that I couldn't learn any other language for that matter, or that it implicitly denied my other identity as, this kid who was born in Latin America, which is of course untrue, right? I rather see it as a kind of enrichment of who I am and of the identity and the person that I became. And I happen to speak English, and I happen to speak French, and I happen to speak Spanish, and that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. And coming from Latin America to the culture of Quebec, it was a necessity that I would learn the common language, the lingua franca of the society, so that I could function. Without that, and without that ability, I would have been condemned to darkness and poverty and everything else.
Okay, well said, Marco. I believe you wanted to say a comment, Mark.
Yes, I have on the topic of cultural genocide. One of the documents I collected when I started digging away in books and documents and clippings is this very interesting one. It's entitled First Reader of the English and Blackfoot Languages with Pictures and Words, prepared by order of the Department of Indian Affairs for the use of industrial schools, the earlier form of residential schools, among them the Blackfoot tribes in the Northwest Territories. And it was published in 1886, and I wish I could say I've learned a lot of Blackfoot from it, but what I really learned from it, of course, is that if the government of Canada really wanted to get rid of Indigenous culture, why in heaven's name did they make dictionaries and other documents, similar documents? It just doesn't make any sense, and I think Canadians have more sense than that.
Okay, so thank you, Mark. I mean, what struck me about the book is that it's an incisive analysis from a number of perspectives about the Truth and Reconciliation Report. It both acknowledges the very positive things and intentions regarding the schools, but also the tragedies around them. Yes. So it's not, and I think you get into this as the co-editors, Rod and Mark, is that you resist the temptation for this kind of binary thinking, this kind of black and white simplistic thinking. And I think that was a very impressive comment. So what did you mean by that, Rod?
Well, we use the analogy of the knights and the knaves as an example of the polarization that we've got, talking about this issue in which some people define themselves as being knights and people who disagree with them as being knaves. And we use a philosophical position to go back and look at that and say, really, there's a middle point between these two conceptions in which people can actually talk to each other and have a reasonable discussion about these issues and put actual physical evidence on the table to deal with. And we haven't really come to that position yet, but that's still the position that Mark and I have, and all of the authors in the book, is that if we can't talk to each other, we can't get to reconciliation, because we haven't figured out what the truth is. And some of the claims that they made about genocide and cultural genocide and forced to attend, and all children were punished severely at the schools, we don't think is true in every incident. It may have been true in some incidents, that's for sure, but not every child was treated as badly as they presented. And until we could actually talk about that, we've got we're missing each other in terms of having a discussion and a resolution. Just as an example, my sister-in-law, my wife's older sister, Rosella, was in school in grade 4, and the supervisor said forced her to eat when she's thrown up in her porridge in the morning, and so when she come home on the weekend to the family farm, she told her parents what had happened. Uh, Her father, Arthur, spoke to his father. On Sunday, they went to the school. They were going to take the children back and then attend the service in the chapel in the school, which was a parish church. They told the principal that Rosella had said that she was forced to eat the porridge that she had thrown up into or spit up into. And on Tuesday, this lady was fired from the school and from being a supervisor, and was on a train going back to Ontario. Uh,
Okay.
so the people weren't completely powerless in having an effect upon the way. And there's lots of examples in the TRC Commission report of the same sort of thing, where parents petitioned schools that saying that the food wasn't adequate, or that some other kids were uh, mistreating younger children, or that some supervisors didn't act appropriately, and things were changed on that basis. So the way they're presenting it is that these people had absolutely no agency at all. That's not
Yeah.
my
No,
experience. I'm sure.
no, I think that's a very powerful story, Ron, is that, and there's many examples of this where parents were loving, engaged parents in their children's education. They were engaged. They were not passive, just twiddling their thumbs, enabling all kinds of abuse to happen. Now, there were issues of abuse, and I believe, if memory serves me correctly, in the TRC report, there were some 11 persons charged of abuse, and who knows what the real number is. But the point is that parents were involved, and I believe also chiefs and different councils were very involved, as I believe in terms of procedure, they had to request the presence of a residential school. So part of this history is quite a revelation, and in contrast with the narrative today. So as we get to the end of our far-reaching discussion here about the second edition book, I would like to ask you, each of you, as we kind of wrap things up, about hope. As we think about this book, and I mean, obviously, many Canadians are somewhat polarized over this history of residential schools. We've been fed a steady diet of a complete simplistic black narrative, if we can use that term, regarding this issue. Where are the signs of hope, and where are the actions that we should be taking? I certainly encourage people to buy the book. I encourage you to share it with others. Ask them, what do you think? Have a healthy debate, have a healthy discussion, instead of labeling each other denialists. So what are your signs of hope? And I'm wondering who wants to go first. Mark, do you want to comment first about where's hope and what people should be doing?
Well, the good reception that our book received, sorry, English teachers should know better than to repeat themselves like that. The very good reception given to our book when it first came out has certainly encouraged me. And when I speak to individuals, perhaps members of my book club, or people at the senior center where I volunteer, and so on, and they agree that the story has become too one-sided and so on, that's tremendously encouraging, because these are what you would call, average Canadians, and they seem to have a bit of sense, and they seem to understand that something as complicated as the Indian residential schools cannot be summed up in some kind of cartoon version, just black and white, good guys, bad guys. There's a lot to it, and I'm encouraged that some Canadians are realizing that, or have always realized it.
Very good, Mark. Any closing comments, Barbara?
Well, I would like to feel hopeful, but I do not feel hopeful under the present political leadership in the country, which is very much married to the same attitudes and manipulative words, and the kind of the idea that there is something holy and reverential that about First Nations, that anything that they want, anything. So our leadership is very much part of the problem. So what I see hope in is that leadership is probably not going to last more than another year. And I sincerely hope that the new leadership, and I assume it will be the Conservative Party of Canada, will take an active interest in reframing the discussion, and will encourage true historical research and get rid of all this denialist nonsense and all these, and take away the appointments of people like Kimberly Murray and all these people who are activists, not historians. They are making it worse, not better. So that's my hope.
No, but it's a very interesting comment, because I know that so many have suggested there frankly should be an inquiry on a number of these questions that are outstanding and get to the facts.
Yeah.
Because there's been a lot of claims made. We've heard claims regarding mass graves without a shred of evidence. That's a problem in our society in terms of the rule of law when you make those kinds of assertions without backing them up with evidence. Marco, any closing comments on your end?
I agree with Barb that it's hard to be hopeful under the current circumstances, but I'm also reminded of that quote people like to throw around from Jack Layton, that love is more powerful than fear, love is more powerful than hate. And Canadians are at heart, I think, fair people. And I think they will see in their own hearts and in the hearts of their neighbors and in the history of this country that this is a place where people are welcome, where people have been welcome. This is a place where people have suffered. There's no denying that. But in the end, the light and the truth, I think, always prevails over the darkness.
I like your message of love over fear and truth over fear. Well said, Marco. And Rod, will you do the last word here?
Sure, I'll say the last word. When the Anglican Church had its apology in 1993, parents-in-law flew in from Calgary and was taken out to Menaki Lodge, close to Kenora, for this meeting with thousands, or maybe 1,000 people. It was a big meeting, and Elaine and I went out and got them. And on Wednesday, they were supposed to stay the whole week. They couldn't stomach what was going on, all the negative. And my mother-in-law was saying, what is people crying over this spilt milk? They're crying over this spilt milk. And so on the way back, I asked her, I said, Mom, what did you learn that was positive in residential schools? And she said to me, without missing a beat, she said, I'm speaking to you, aren't I? She was speaking English, right? So, and otherwise, when you look at the minutes of any of these meetings, they're all written in English or French. They're not written in Aboriginal languages. People may greet each other in their Aboriginal languages, but they don't speak to each other in their Aboriginal language. The only languages that hold people together in this country are English and French, and these people all learned how to speak those languages. And to build on Mark's point, increasingly the sales of Grave Heirs, the book that Chris Champion and Tom Flanagan edited, and our book will give people a different perspective, and their sales are going up. They're increasingly so. We're hopeful that people will read and make up their own mind on the basis of looking at both what the other side says and what we have to say. That's what I think is hope.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Rod Clifton and Mark Dewolf, co-editors of the second edition book, as well as the entire team. I want to congratulate you for a job well done, and for this panel, including Barbara Kay, columnist. Often we can read your columns in the National Post and elsewhere. And of course, Marco Navarro-Genie, the Vice President of Policy and Research at Frontier. Thank you so much for joining this engaging discussion. And I believe I have a comment from the audience, from Matthew M. If someone already has the first edition, how much new material in the second edition is to justify buying it? That's a great question. So, Mark, do you want to take a quick response to that
I
one.
think I get it. Rod may correct me, but there's a brand new chapter that contains testimonies from former IRS staff and students collected by a Nova Scotian woman, all on her own, using a typewriter, collecting testimonies from all these people. It's a wonderful chapter to read. I encourage people to get the book, if only for that chapter. But there's also a new conclusion. And the conclusion, of course, was written with a perspective of Canada today. Has anything changed in the last few years since the first edition? So the conclusion deals with a bit of that and wraps things up fairly nicely, I think, Rod.
Yeah, I think those are two worth receiving. Unfortunately, you have to buy the book to get those two chapters, and we've revised and rewritten, some things, and we put some things in on the death of children, in chapter 2 as well. But that's about it.
Well, I certainly encourage everyone, including Matthew M., to purchase the book, and if it's not enough new material, then to gift it to someone else. I think it's a very, not only fascinating analysis of the TRC report that I think in many respects will shock you if you haven't picked up some of those facts today in this discussion, but it's a very moving one. There's a lot of human story that brings this together and helps us gain perspective as fellow Canadians who love this country and also love the pursuit of truth as we try to live together in peace and harmony. So for me, again, I encourage you to find the book. You can find it on both Amazon as well as through the Frontier Center for Public Policy. So don't hesitate to get in touch, and that can be shipped to you. But this has been a very heartwarming conversation about a difficult, challenging topic that is so important for Canadians to understand. I think it's been said many times before that truth matters, history matters, and if we lose that tradition of criticism, then we lose not only the engine of progress and prosperity, but dare I say civilization. So on that note, again, thank you everyone for joining us for this conversation. And until next week, we'll look forward to our next discussion on Leaders on the Frontier.
Thank you, David.